All right. This is one of those stories where everything sounds completely normal. At least, until you actually start paying attention. And once he really genuinely started paying attention, things stopped making sense very quickly. On the surface, solid marriage, good home, reasonable life, the kind of setup where, if you'd asked anyone on the outside, they would have told you these two had it together. Underneath? Yeah, not so much. You know, the type of situation where the explanation technically works, as long as you don't think about it too long. Where everything lines up just well enough that you almost convince yourself you're the problem for even noticing. That's exactly where Brandon Scott found himself. And the thing about Brandon, the thing that matters here, is that he wasn't the type to spiral. He wasn't reactive. He wasn't dramatic. He was the kind of man who observed quietly, filed things away, and waited until the picture was complete before he said a single word. So when his phone rang at 2 in the morning and his wife Alyssa's voice came through the line, calm, casual, unbothered, telling him she'd be late and not to worry, he didn't panic, he didn't accuse, he just listened. And in the background, just barely audible beneath the sound of her voice, he heard a man laugh. So he said 2 words. Take your time. And then he started paying attention. Brandon and Alyssa Scott had been married for 6 years. Not a perfect marriage, nothing is, but a functional one, a real one. They'd built something together that most people would look at and call solid. A house in a quiet suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. 2 cars. A dog named Hank that was technically Alyssa's but had clearly chosen Brandon as his person. A Friday night routine that usually involved takeout and whatever show they were halfway through at the time. Shared finances, shared responsibilities, a shared life. Brandon was 34. He worked in logistics management, coordinating supply chains, reviewing contracts, solving problems quietly before they became bigger problems. It was the kind of job that rewarded patience, pattern recognition, and the ability to stay calm when everything around you was falling apart. He was good at it, had been doing it for almost a decade. Alyssa was 32. She worked as a dental hygienist at a practice about 20 minutes from their house. Regular hours, mostly predictable schedule, good income. She was sociable, organized, kept their home running with a kind of effortless precision that Brandon genuinely appreciated. She had a close group from a few women she'd known since college, couple she'd met through work. She had a life outside of their marriage, which Brandon had always considered healthy. He wasn't a controlling man. He never checked her phone, never demanded she explain where she was going or who she was with. He trusted her. That was the foundation of their marriage as far as he was concerned. Trust. Which is what made the first few things so easy to dismiss. Because at first, and he wants to be honest about this, it was nothing. It was the kind of nothing that you almost feel foolish for registering. The kind of nothing that, if you mentioned it out loud, would make you sound paranoid. It started in early March. Alyssa began staying later at the practice. Not dramatically late. Not hours. But where she used to be home by 5:45 on most days, she started drifting in closer to 7. Sometimes 7:30. The first few times, she mentions a new patient load. End-of-day appointments that ran over. Administrative work that had been backed up since one of the front desk staff left. All of that was plausible. Dental offices run late. Schedules shift. He'd heard about the staffing situation before, so it wasn't coming out of nowhere. He didn't think much of it. Then she started going to the gym more frequently. Again, not alarming. Alyssa had always been someone who cycled through fitness phases. She'd go hard for a few months, fall off, pick it back up. Brandon had a gym membership himself that he used inconsistently and felt vaguely guilty about. So when she mentioned she was trying to get back on a consistent schedule and had signed up for some evening classes, he was supportive. That's great, he told her. And he meant it. She started coming home later on those days too, which made sense. Gym, shower, commute. He did the math, it tracked. But here's the thing about Brandon. He was a logistics man. He tracked things without meaning to. Not because he was suspicious, but because his brain was wired to notice patterns. It was just how he processed the world. And somewhere around the third week of March, some quiet back-of-the-mind part of him registered something small: her gym bag. She left for her Wednesday class with a full bag, water bottle, change of clothes, the little towel she clipped to the side. She came home with a dry bag, not damp, not slightly wet from a quick wipe down, dry. The clothes inside, when she tossed the bag near the laundry room, weren't the kind of sweaty mess you'd expect from someone who'd just done an hour of cardio or a class. He noticed it the way you notice a small discrepancy in a spreadsheet, not with alarm, just with a quiet, He filed it away and said nothing. There were other small things. She started keeping her phone face down more often. Not always, but often enough that he noticed the shift. She'd always been fairly casual about her phone before. Left it on the counter, face up, buzzed across the table without reaching for it immediately. Now it was face down on the nightstand, face down on the coffee table, tucked into her pocket more frequently than before. Again, individually, none of this was a red flag. People adjust their habits. People get more protective of their phones as they get older, just out of habit, just out of the ambient awareness of how much personal data lives on those devices. But the dry gym bag, the phone face down, the later evenings, he filed it all away. One night, a Thursday in late March, he came home to find Alyssa just finishing a phone call. She was in the kitchen, back half turned toward the door, speaking in that low, slightly clipped tone that people use when they're trying to wrap up a conversation efficiently. When she heard him come in, she said, "I'll talk to you later," into the phone, and turned around with a completely natural smile. "Hey, you're home," she said. "How was your day?" And he said it was fine and asked who she was talking to. "Rachel," she said. "Just drama with her and Derek again." He nodded and went to hang up his jacket. Rachel was one of Alyssa's college friends. She and her husband Derek did, historically, have an on and off contentious dynamic, so that particular explanation was one of the easier ones to accept. He almost did. Except that 2 days earlier he'd seen Alyssa's phone light up on the counter while she was in the shower. He hadn't tried to read it. He genuinely had not looked, but he'd seen the name on the notification. It wasn't Rachel. It was a name he didn't recognize. Kevin. He'd clocked it the way you clock a word in a document that doesn't quite belong. Logged it. Said nothing about it. Went on with his evening. Kevin. He didn't know an Alyssa friend named Kevin. He didn't know a Kevin from her office. He'd met most of her colleagues at some point, and he couldn't place the name. He didn't know a Kevin from their neighborhood or their social circle. Could be nothing, could be a patient, a vendor contact, someone from a fitness class, someone from her past who'd reconnected. He told himself of that. He mostly believed it. But the dry gym bag was still dry in his memory, and the phone was still face down, and the call had been described as Rachel, and the name he'd seen had not been Rachel. At least, that's what he was supposed to believe. He went to bed that night next to his wife, who fell asleep easily and peacefully beside him. And he stared at the ceiling for longer than he would have liked. He wasn't ready to think anything definitive. He wasn't even close to certain. He'd been wrong before. Once, a couple of years into their marriage, he'd convinced himself something was off, and it had turned out to be Alyssa quietly planning a surprise trip for his birthday. He'd felt stupid about that for a while. It had made him more cautious about jumping to conclusions, so he told himself he was being careful. That was the word he used in his own mind. Careful. Not suspicious, not paranoid, just paying attention. He didn't know what yet, but something was. April came in quietly. Brandon kept working, kept coming home, kept having dinners and conversations and normal Saturday mornings with Alyssa the way they always had. On the surface, nothing had changed. If you'd sat across from them at a restaurant or run into them at the grocery store, you would have seen a normal couple. Comfortable, easy, familiar in the way that 6-year marriages tend to be. He watched. He didn't snoop. He didn't dig. He just watched the way he watched supply chain data, not trying to force a conclusion, just letting the information accumulate until it organized itself into something coherent. And by mid-April, it had started to organize. The gym pattern was the first thing that crystallized. Alyssa had mentioned signing up for Tuesday and Thursday evening classes. That was the stated schedule. But by the third week of April, she was also adding Saturdays. They added a morning session I've been wanting to try, she told him one Friday night. I'm going to give it a shot tomorrow. That's good, he said. The next morning she left at 9:15 with her gym bag. She came back at 12:40. For a morning gym class, that was a long trip. The gym was 11 minutes from their house. He knew this because he'd been there himself. Even factoring in a class, a shower, some time to cool down and chat, 2 hours was the outer edge of reasonable. 3.5 was not. He didn't say anything. He asked how the class was. Really good, she said. The instructor was great. I'll probably go back next week. He nodded and asked if she wanted lunch. Sure. Sounds great. The phone had become a consistent habit now. Always face down. Always close. Always retrieved quickly when it buzzed. She'd also started taking it into the bathroom with her, which was something she'd never done before. He'd noticed it only because Hank had developed the habit of sitting outside the bathroom door whenever either of them was in there, and one evening Brandon came down the hall to find Hank sitting patiently outside the door while Alyssa was in the shower. And her phone, which normally lived on the charger beside the bed, was in the bathroom with her. He went back to the living room and sat with this information. Then there were the excuses. The pattern of excuses was, if he was being precise about it, the thing that bothered him most. Not because any individual one was obviously a lie, most of them were technically plausible, but because of the consistency of the categories. Running late at work, girls' night, gym, traffic was bad, stopped to grab something, ran into a friend. One of these reasons approximately twice per week across a 6-week span. Each one self-contained, each one reasonable, each one slightly resistant to follow-up questions in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. When he asked about the girls' night, the details were there but just slightly vague. Names were mentioned, but the specifics of the evening were given in a summary-style way rather than a conversational, disorganized way people actually recount a fun night with friends. That explanation came a little too prepared. The other thing was the emotional temperature. He'd been trying to find the right word for it for a few weeks. And the word he eventually landed on was managed. Alyssa's emotional engagement with him had become slightly managed. Not cold, she wasn't distant in any obvious way. She was still warm, still affectionate in the surface ways, still laughed at the same things, and engaged in conversation normally. But there was a quality to it that felt slightly curated, like she was maintaining a consistent output rather than just being naturally present with him. He wasn't sure if anyone else would have noticed it. It was the kind of thing that might only be visible to someone who'd known her well for 6 years and had a baseline to compare it to. He noticed. Around the third week of April, he did something small. He mentioned casually that he'd run into someone from the dental practice at the coffee place near his office. A woman named Diane, who was one of the front desk staff Alyssa had mentioned by name before. He had not run into Diane. He'd never met Diane. He made this up. He was curious what Alyssa would do with it. She paused for just a fraction of a second longer than a genuine recollection would require. Barely noticeable, but there, and then said, "Oh yeah? What did she say?" "Nothing much," he said. "Just said hi. She seemed nice." "She is," Alyssa said. "She's great. Normal enough." But the slight hesitation had been there. Just a half-second recalibration before the comfortable answer, like she'd been checking something against an internal list before she responded. He didn't push it. The name Kevin came up one more time. It was toward the end of April. He'd been keeping an ear out, though he wasn't sure he'd expected to hear it again so quickly. They were watching television on a Wednesday evening, and her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. She glanced at it. and he happened to be positioned at an angle where he couldn't see the screen, but he watched her expression. It was a micro-expression, the kind that flickers across a face in under a second and is gone before the person is even fully aware of it. A small brightening, not quite a smile, just a momentary lift, and then she set the phone face down. "Who was that?" he asked, keeping his voice completely level. "Rachel," she said. "She wants to know if we're free next weekend." He said he'd have to check his schedule. She nodded and unmuted the TV. He watched the rest of the episode and thought about the micro-expression, and about the name he'd seen on the notification 3 weeks earlier. Kevin. He thought about the dry gym bag, the prepared explanations, the phone in the bathroom, the 3.5-hour Saturday, the slight hesitation at Diane's name. Individually, maybe not. Together, not great. He was careful not to say things to himself he couldn't yet prove. He'd been wrong before, and he remembered the feeling of that. The sick embarrassment of having built an entire case in his head, only to have it dissolve into birthday balloons and a weekend trip itinerary. He did not want to repeat that. But this was different. He could feel the difference, even if he couldn't fully articulate it yet. This wasn't an accumulation of misread signals. This was a pattern, and patterns don't lie. They don't have a reason to. The 2 a.m. call happened on a Thursday night in the first week of May. Brandon had been asleep. Lightly, the way he usually slept when Alyssa was out late. That half-conscious monitoring mode his brain defaulted to when the other side of the bed was empty. She'd told him she was going to a late dinner with her work friend Stephanie, who was apparently going through something with her boyfriend and needed to talk. He'd said, of course, take your time, and had gone to bed around 11 with a book he'd barely read 2 pages of before setting it down. The phone rang at 2:04 a.m. He answered immediately. "Hey," Alyssa said. Her voice was easy, unhurried. "Sorry to wake you. I'm going to be a little later than I thought. Stephanie's still kind of a mess. I'll be home in an hour or so, okay? Don't wait up." "Okay," he said. And then faintly in the background, behind the ambient noise of wherever she was, he heard a man's voice. Not words, just a low tone. A short sound, like a quiet laugh or an acknowledgement of something. The kind of sound a person makes when they're in a relaxed, comfortable space with someone they're at ease with. Gone in under a second, but there. He registered it with the same quiet precision he registered everything. "Take your time," he said. "Thanks, babe. Love you." Yep, he hung up. He sat in the dark bedroom for a moment. Hank had lifted his head from the foot of the bed when the phone rang and was watching him with that patient, slightly concerned dog expression that always seemed vaguely too perceptive. Brandon scratched behind Hank's ear and sat there in the quiet, running the call back in his mind. The ease in her voice, the practiced explanation, the background voice. He didn't feel anger. He felt something else, something colder and more methodical. The feeling he got when a supply chain discrepancy finally revealed itself after weeks of quiet investigation. The feeling of the picture coming into focus. Right. Okay. He lay back down and didn't sleep. He wasn't going to confront her that night. He wasn't going to confront her at all, not until he knew exactly what he knew. Because he'd learned from working in a field where underprepared confrontations caused expensive, irreversible problems that you never acted on a feeling when you could act on a fact. He needed facts. The next morning he was calm. Alyssa came in around 3:30 and slid into bed quietly, and in the morning she was up making coffee before he was, and she asked how he'd slept, and he said okay, and everything looked completely normal. He started quietly that day. The first thing he did was look up the gym she'd been attending. He found it online in about 40 seconds, pulled up their class schedule, and found every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday class she'd claimed to attend over the prior 6 weeks. He cross-referenced the timing against when she'd left and returned. He wasn't expecting everything to be a lie, but he found 3 dates where the class she'd said she attended hadn't been scheduled that day. He noted them. The second thing was simple and required no technology at all. He got home before Alyssa one evening and took a clear-eyed look at the gym bag she'd left near the laundry room. He unzipped it and looked inside. The workout clothes were folded, not perfectly, not like she'd never worn them, but with the kind of casual neatness of someone who'd taken them out and refolded them without actually using them. The water bottle was full, sealed and full. He zipped it back up and walked away. Yeah, that wasn't a coincidence. On Saturday of that week, she left for the gym at 9:20. He waited 10 minutes, then drove to the gym. He parked down the street and waited. He wasn't proud of this. It felt like a line being crossed, some invisible threshold between being watchful and being the person who sits in parking lots. But he sat with the discomfort and waited anyway. At 11:55, Alyssa's car pulled out of a side street, approximately 3 blocks from the gym. She had not parked at the gym. She had not, as far as he could observe, been at the gym. He followed at a distance, far enough that she wouldn't notice, close enough to maintain visual contact. She drove for about 12 minutes and pulled into the parking lot of a mid-range hotel on the east side of the city. He parked on the far side of the lot. He watched her walk inside. At that point, it stopped being a feeling. He sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes. He didn't get out. He didn't go in. He just sat with the weight of what he was now certain of and let it settle. What he felt wasn't what he would have expected. He'd always assumed, in the abstract, that a moment like this would come with a wave of emotion, anger or grief or some kind of collapse. Instead, what he felt was clarity. A cold, clean, oddly organizing clarity. He knew. Now he needed to know everything else. He drove home. When Alyssa came back 90 minutes later, gym bag in tow, he was in the living room with his laptop open and a completely normal expression on his face. "How was it?" he asked. "Really good," she said. "Tired though." "Go relax," he said. She smiled and went upstairs. He went back to his laptop and, for the first time since March, he searched the name Kevin with real intention. He didn't have a last name yet, but he knew what he was looking for now, and he was going to find it. Brandon Scott spent the next 6 days in what he would later describe to himself as a state of deliberate calm. Not denial, not numbness, deliberate. He made a conscious choice every morning to operate with precision rather than emotion. He treated the situation the way he would treat a failing vendor relationship. Methodically, with documentation, without any action that might alert the other party before he was ready to move. Because Alyssa didn't know he knew. And as long as Alyssa didn't know he knew, he had every advantage. The first order of business was Kevin. He thought through everything he had. The name on her phone. The date, 3 weeks into March, when he'd first seen it. The frequency of the face-down phone behavior, which had begun roughly around that same time. He pulled up Alyssa's social media. She was active on 2 platforms, though she'd set most of her content to private or friends only years ago. He wasn't connected to all of her connections, but through a combination of her public-facing tags, some mutual acquaintances, and the kind of patient lateral searching that his work had made him genuinely skilled at, he found what he was looking for in approximately 4 hours. Kevin Foster, 36 years old, personal trainer, worked at, among other places, he paused when he saw this, a gym on the east side of the city, the same side of the city as that hotel. He sat back in his chair and took a long, level breath. There it is. He found Kevin Foster's professional profile, his business page, his general public digital footprint, and then, with the kind of careful patience he was increasingly grateful he possessed, he found something useful. Kevin Foster had been tagged in a public post from a group fitness page about 2 months ago. In the background of a gym photo, out of focus but recognizable, was a woman in a light blue top with her hair pulled back. Brandon had bought Alyssa that top for her birthday. He closed his laptop and went and fed Hank his dinner. He had a name and a face. He had a location pattern. He had 3 documented dates where the alibi didn't hold up. He had the parking lot observation. He had the hotel. He needed the confrontation moment to be airtight, not just emotionally definitive. legally, financially, and socially airtight, because he'd already made the decision. He wasn't going to fight for the marriage. He hadn't made that decision in anger. He'd made it in that parking lot, sitting 40 minutes in a hotel parking lot watching his wife's car, and it had arrived with a quietness that surprised him. There was nothing to rebuild here. He didn't want to have the conversation 1,000 times. He didn't want the months of therapy where you slowly determine whether trust can be reconstructed from scratch. He didn't want to look at her across the dinner table every night, knowing what had been happening in that hotel, knowing what the gym bag was actually for, knowing about Kevin Foster's gym on the east side of the city. He wanted out, clean, complete, and on his terms. So he called a lawyer, not a dramatic call, not an emotionally charged conversation, a practical, professional call to a family law attorney his company had used for a business matter several years ago. He explained his situation in broad terms. He was informed of the process. He was told what documentation would be useful. He was told what his options were. He was also, quietly, advised that how he handled the next few days could significantly affect the process. He took notes. On Sunday evening, he quietly began separating certain financial elements. Not all of it, nothing so abrupt that Alyssa would notice an account change or a missing card, but he opened a new individual account at a different bank and began moving portions of his income there. He documented his existing assets carefully. He pulled his credit report. He noted which accounts were joint and which were individual. He was thorough. He was also, and he needed to be honest about this part, waiting for something specific. He wanted the confrontation to include Alyssa lying to him one more time. Not out of cruelty, not out of some need to watch her fail, but because he wanted there to be zero ambiguity when it was done. He wanted her to know that he knew all of it, the full picture. And he wanted her to have tried to explain her way out of it first, so that when he laid everything on the table, there was absolutely nothing left for her to say. He waited. He gave her the space to keep pretending. She was very confident. He'd give her that. On Tuesday evening, she came home 45 minutes later than usual, and told him she'd stayed to cover for a colleague whose daughter had a school thing. He said that was thoughtful of her. She made dinner, and they watched television, and she kissed him on the cheek before she went upstairs, and he sat in the living room with Hank and looked at the blank TV screen after it turned off. Almost impressive, actually, if you didn't know what you were looking at. On Wednesday, he confirmed the hotel with a level of specificity he hadn't had before. He'd been methodical, not reckless, nothing that would expose him or complicate his legal situation. And by Wednesday evening, he had the name of the hotel, confirmation of the frequency of these visits based on his own documented observations, and a few other details he'd quietly pieced together, and enough to present a clear, coherent picture of what had been happening for at least 6 to 8 weeks. He also, on Wednesday evening, sent a brief professional message to a woman named Sandra Foster, Kevin Foster's wife. He'd found Sandra the same way he'd found Kevin, patiently and through publicly available information. She and Kevin had been married for 4 years. She had a small business, a home staging and interior design operation that had a modest but active social presence. She lived, he established, roughly 30 minutes north of the city. His message to Sandra was short and completely without drama. It said, in substance, I believe our spouses have been seeing each other. I have documentation. I think you deserve to know. I'll be having a conversation with my wife on Saturday. You don't have to do anything with this. I wanted you to have the information. He included one photograph he'd found publicly, one that showed both Alyssa and Kevin in the background of the same public gym post. And then he closed the message and did not look at it again. He didn't know what Sandra would do with it. That wasn't his concern. She was an adult woman who deserved to have the truth, and what she chose to do from there was entirely her own business. His concern was Saturday. He'd chosen Saturday because Alyssa had mentioned she was going to the gym in the morning. Of course she was. And he'd decided to let her go. He wouldn't follow her this time. He didn't need to. He'd wait for her to come home, fresh from wherever she'd actually been, relaxed and confident and ready to walk back into the life she'd been maintaining on two separate tracks. And he'd be sitting in the living room when she came in. And he'd let her think everything was normal. He would ask how the class was. She would tell him it was great. And then he'd ask her to sit down. He spent Friday evening with Hank and a quiet dinner by himself. Alyssa had a girls' night, naturally, and he laid out everything he had in a folder on his desk. The notes, the documentation, the lawyer's consultation summary, the divorce filing, which his attorney had already prepared, and which sat in a manila envelope with Alyssa's full legal name on the front. He looked at it for a while. Then he fed Hank, put the folder away, and went to bed. He slept better than he had in 6 weeks. Saturday morning, Alyssa was up at 8:45. She made coffee, moved around the kitchen with the easy, unhurried energy of a woman who had no idea that anything was different, who believed the architecture of the life she'd been carefully maintaining was still intact. Brandon sat at the kitchen table with his own coffee and watched her. She was bright, chatty. She mentioned that she'd had a good time last night, that Rachel and one of the other girls had been particularly funny, that she was glad she'd gone out. She mentioned the weather was nice and asked if he wanted to do anything that afternoon. Maybe lunch somewhere, a walk, something easy. He said that sounded good. She kissed him on the cheek, grabbed her gym bag, and told him she'd be back by noon. "Take your time," he said. She laughed a little and headed for the door. He watched her car back out of the driveway. He took a long, slow breath. He went to his desk and retrieved the manila envelope. He brought it to the living room and set it on the coffee table. He sat down, poured himself a second cup of coffee, and put on something quiet in the background, the kind of low music that made a room feel less tense, though in this case tension was probably appropriate. He thought about calling someone. A friend, maybe, or his brother. He decided against it. This was his to handle. He sat with Hank, who seemed to sense that something was happening and had placed his head on Brandon's knee, with the solemn gravity of a dog who takes his emotional support role seriously. Alyssa came home at 12:23. She came through the front door with her gym bag over one shoulder and an easy expression on her face, the practiced version of someone returning from a completely normal morning. She was in workout clothes. She'd made some effort toward the presentation this time. Hair back, shoes that looked like workout shoes, the full, visible architecture of the alibi. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag near the stairs. "How was your morning?" "Good," Brandon said. She walked toward the kitchen, glancing at him as she passed the living room. "You want to grab lunch somewhere?" "I was thinking maybe, actually," he said. "Can you come sit down for a minute?" She paused, looked at him. There was a beat, maybe half a second, where something crossed her face that wasn't quite readable. Then she composed it and said, "Yeah, of course. What's up?" She came and sat across from him on the couch. She noticed the manila envelope on the coffee table between them. He watched her eyes go to it, register it, and return to his face. "What's that?" she asked. "In a second," he said. "I want to ask you about this morning first. How was the class?" She tilted her head slightly, the micro-expression of someone recalibrating, and said, "It was good. Good energy, good instructor. Same class I've been going to. The Tuesday-Thursday group, and Saturdays now, yeah." He nodded slowly. "You know what I find interesting," he said, and he kept his voice completely even, the way he kept his voice in conference calls, when the conversation was about to become very uncomfortable for someone on the other end of the line. "Is that when I drove past that gym this morning, your car wasn't there." Silence. Not a long silence. She filled it quickly. "I parked on the street," she said. "They were full." He nodded. "The street I drove down? Maybe a different one." "Maybe." He looked at her. "Alyssa, I've driven past that gym on 4 different Saturday mornings over the last 6 weeks. Your car has never been there. Another silence. Slightly longer this time. Brandon. I was also in the parking lot of the Meridian Suites on May 3rd, he said, naming the hotel with a quiet, almost conversational precision. For about 40 minutes, I watched you walk in. The color shifted in her face. It was subtle. She had a good command of herself, he'd give her that, but the blood had visibly moved from her cheeks, in a way that no amount of composure could fully mask. That's not, she stopped. I know about Kevin Foster, he said. I know about the gym he works at. I know the hotel. I know the approximate timeline. It looks like late February or early March, based on when the pattern shifted. I know what the gym bag is actually for. He paused. I'm not asking you to confirm any of this. I already know it. She was very still. Brandon, she said finally, and her voice had changed. The ease was gone. What was underneath it was something scrambled and searching, looking for a foothold. Can you let me explain? You can explain if you want to, he said. I'm not going to stop you. She did try. He listened. It was what he'd expected. There was a version of events that involved the two of them, having grown apart, feeling disconnected. She hadn't been looking for it. It had just happened. She was sorry. She knew how it looked. She wanted to figure out if they could work through it together. She said she cared about him. She said she hadn't wanted to hurt him. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he sat quietly for a moment. I've been to see a lawyer, he said. That's the filing. He nodded toward the manila envelope. My attorney drafted it this week. Everything's documented. The timeline, what I observed, the financial records. The accounts I had access to have already been separated. My name has been removed from 3 of our joint accounts, and a new individual account has been opened in my name alone. I spoke to our mortgage lender on Thursday. I've been methodical about it. She was staring at him. You can contest it if you want, he said. That's your right. But I want to be clear with you about where I stand. I'm not interested in mediation. I'm not interested in couples therapy. And I'm not interested in a different version of this story. I want a clean process and I want to be done. Brandon, her voice had broken slightly. You can't just, we've been married for 6 years. You can't just have a file already prepared. I've known about this since early March, he said. I had time to prepare. That landed. He watched it land. Watched the understanding of what that meant move across her face, that he'd known for 2 months and had said nothing, had sat across from her at dinner and said goodnight and watched television and asked how her gym class was, all while knowing exactly what he knew. 2 months, she said quietly. Approximately, yes. She put her face in her hands. He wasn't angry. He wanted to be honest about that, not for her benefit, not to be gracious, but because it was true and it mattered to him to be accurate about his own emotional state. He wasn't angry anymore. He had been, briefly, in the beginning, a cold and controlled version of it. Nothing volatile, but that had burned through somewhere around day 3, leaving behind something that felt a lot like resolution, like a file closed and moved to archive. I didn't want to do it this way, Alyssa said into her hands. I know, I didn't want to hurt you. I know that too. She looked up. Her eyes were wet, and she wasn't managing her expression anymore. What was on her face now was real. Distress, regret, and something that looked like the dawning understanding that she had profoundly miscalculated how this was going to go. Is there anything I can say? She asked. He considered the question for a moment, with genuine consideration, the way he considered every question. No, he said simply. Not really. He picked up his coffee cup, stood, and Hank stood with him. The filing has a response period. Your attorney will explain the timeline when you retain someone. I'd suggest doing that soon. He paused at the doorway. I'm going to take Hank for a walk. He put on his jacket. He clipped Hank's leash. He opened the front door. Behind him, he heard Alyssa make a sound, something between a breath and a sob that he allowed himself to register, and then he let it go. He walked outside. The morning was clear, cool, the quiet kind of Saturday that Columbus does, well, where the neighborhood is just starting to wake up and everything has that unhurried, ordinary feeling. He walked down the driveway. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He took it out and looked at the screen. It was a message from Sandra Foster. "Thank you for telling me. I'm sorry for what you're going through. I've already spoken to a lawyer too." He read it once, then put his phone away. He walked. There wasn't really much else to say at that point. Alyssa had called him at 2 in the morning, voice easy and unhurried, telling him not to worry. He hadn't worried. He'd paid attention. And when you pay attention, really pay attention, the kind that's patient and quiet and willing to wait for the full picture, what you find tends to be exactly what was there the whole time. He walked with his dog through the quiet Ohio morning, and somewhere behind him, in a house that was now very definitively in the process of becoming his former home, the life he'd thought he had finished coming apart. He didn't look back. He was already done. That's where Brandon's story ends. Calm, controlled, entirely on his terms. The kind of ending that doesn't make noise, because it doesn't need to. She thought a casual lie at 2 in the morning cost her nothing. It cost her everything.